Good morning, everyone. I see we have a packed room again today. It's nice to have you all here. I'm Joanne Bundy, and on behalf of our planning committee, I welcome you to the bucket courses. If you would like to have a DVD of these classes, you'll see in one of your papers on the table the announcements, and that will give you the procedure of requesting and buying a DVD for AR's 3 classes. The siren may go off this morning. I think they're having a tornado drill. And so if it does, don't worry, everything is okay. But that reminds me, please check your cell phone. Make sure that it's silenced. We don't mind the siren. We can't do anything about that, but we can control our cell phones. We've had a little change in the procedure for this class. Instead of having 2 classes on finding the truth and 1 class on Confucius, we're going to have all 3 of these classes on finding the truth. And the good news is that Dr. Paulson is going to come back at a later date and do Confucius. So we'll get the benefit of that. Now, if you silence your cell phone, we will start in on the 2nd class of JR's 3-class course in Finding the Truth. You know that Dr. Paulson is a primary care provider from Grinnell Family Care, and he is arguably the best primary care doctor in the universe. But don't ask him about the universe. That's a whole other topic.
Yeah, there we go.
So here's Dr. J.R. Paulson and Finding the Truth. J.R.
Hey, thank you very much. Can you hear in the back okay? Cool. So let's dim the lights a little bit and this is just a slide of phrenology. Anyone remember phrenology? It was very popular for hundreds of years.
Is that okay?
Different parts of the brain on the skull, departing what part of the skull was like, that's where everything was located. This is not about that. So that's
It's okay.
So advance. A little. Okay, so continuing, part 2 of why we believe. The problem of ergocentric thinking. Those of you that were in my first class, I used this slide and we talked about it, and you got it in the handout. It's very important because this is the theme, one of the main themes of the course. Ergocentric thinking results from the unfortunate fact that humans do not naturally consider the rights and needs of others. They do not naturally appreciate the point of view of others, nor the limitations in their own point of view. They become explicitly aware of their egocentric thinking only if trained to do so, hence this class. They do not naturally recognize their egocentric assumptions, the egocentric way we use information, the egocentric way they interpret data, the source of their egocentric concepts and ideas, the implications of their egocentric thought. They do not naturally recognize their self-serving perspective. And with that thesis, we've already learned in the last session about how evolution programs us to think certain ways. We talked about patternicity as a survival benefit and antigenicity, where we know that we think and we think other people have brains that are kind of like us, but we don't know for sure. But I think you all have brains kind of like me and go through the same processes, but I can't really prove it. And you got this handout. It's true because I believe it. It's true because we believe it. It's true because I want to believe it. It's true because I always believed it. It's true because it's in my selfish interest to believe it. In details. Now, what I've tried to show is in the last 2 classes, or the class before, about processes going on in our brain that makes us think the way we do. So I want to go now into more detail on the why. I could just go on and hop right to the conclusion and say, let's take what we've learned already and talk about God and witches and UFOs and Republicans and Democrats and all of that and hop right in, which is what I want to do. But I want to do that with the next class because I thought I cannot cram that in here. It's no way. That's too much fertile, fun stuff to do. But we're not ready to hop in there yet. We've got too many of our own biases, emotional things. Well, what if you do this? Or he's going to get into God, and ooh, that'll offend people, as my wife would say, or don't talk about sex, or don't, these politics, don't go there because everybody's going to be all over. But by the end of today, we'll be able to go there and feel confident because we'll have the skills and the thinking skills to approach pretty much anything. We hope. This is the survey you folks did. Remember, this was at the start of the class. The left is the demographics from the Harris poll, and your results are on the right. Percent of belief. I just thought we'd flash that up there for a little bit. Talk about it later. Already, you're different from the thousands of Americans. But we knew you were a special group.
Could you turn down the volume a little bit?
Turn the volume down a little bit. Yes, we can. Or you can move this farther away.
I love it.
How's that? Is that better? How about that? Okay. And of course, the last two questions I put in, Obama was Muslim, and Obama was born in Kenya. We'll talk about that in our conspiracy theory tomorrow, or next week. Another theme, though. I want to believe. But the corollary is, my brain wants me to believe too. That's what we're going to talk about. Slide from the first class. Gee, why is no one going in the other theater? Yeah, okay. So the first part, before break, we're going to talk about the chemical basis for belief. So far we've talked about patternicity and agenticity. Now we need to explore the neurochemistry of belief. So I'm going to talk about the neuron and the dopamine system. CTS are called chemical transmitter substances. We have 100 billion neurons in our brain, but they communicate via these chemicals called dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, and epinephrine, and others. Amphetamines speed the release of this into the synapse, and cocaine blocks the reuptake, so in effect keeps the neurons firing. Dopamine is critical to the communication between neurons and also muscles, and a shortage of it causes lack of motor control and shaking, Parkinson's disease. So not only is it important in thinking, but in neurologic disease. Remember the Robin Williams movie, Awakenings? Great movie. Around 2000, true story. Oliver Sacks, who was a young neurologist, L-Dopa had just been invented, and he had this whole ward full of these people that were in comas since 1918 and 1920. They had an influenza that caused this brain condition, encephalitis lethargica, and they were just in a comatose state because it knocked out the dopamine part of their brain. And he gave them, as it's called in the movie, L-Dopa, and they woke up after 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And Robert De Niro was the main guy. Excellent movie. If you want to have some fun, go back and see that. Dopamine is critical in association with learning and the reward system. The release of dopamine tells the organism, do that again. Key point. Dopamine, if it's released, it says, do that again. Repeated use actually causes more synaptic growth with more neural connections in the circuit, reinforced, and produces physical changes or hardwiring. So you do this enough, the nerves change, your brain is rewired, so to speak. So it starts chemically, but then it can rewire, and it does. This occurs equally, no disrespect, in pigeons, rats, and in humans. So it goes on in everybody. Where did we discover it? Back in '54, I remember this study. James Olds at McGill was sticking a bunch of electrodes in rat brains, and he got this one spot, and then all of a sudden the rats just kind of smiled and They'd push that little lever and they'd smile and they'd keep pushing the lever and food would go by and they'd hit the lever and keep smiling. They just died. I mean, they would not even eat or drink. They just pushed the old lever and he went, wow, that's a pretty powerful spot. And it's been called the pleasure center. And we know now that's just causing little shots of dopamine to go in there all the time in that one little spot in the brain. So that electrode is pretty powerful. However, addictive drugs can take over the role of the reward signals too. It's the same as rats. We know people that are really drug addicts. They can destroy their life, kill themselves. Nothing is more important than getting their fix. Just like the rat with the electrode. Dopamine is non-discriminating. Whether you're gambling, pornography, drugs like cocaine flood the brain with dopamine, hence reinforcing the pattern again and again and again and again. Key point, ideas, both good and bad, are also reinforced by the same system. So there's no difference, the same mechanisms going on whether you're gambling, the fix you get when you get that return, or pornography or drugs or whatever, same thing. Pleasure versus motivation, there is a difference. Liking versus wanting. Neuroscientists have found that the positive reinforcement may lead to good behavior, behavioral repetition because doing it will feel good, or not doing it will feel bad. Anxiety, I'm not going to get my next fix. What's going to happen if I don't do this, if I don't do this? We all know that in our lives that sometimes that's a motivating factor. Not getting the thing, but the worrying about not getting the thing. And that can be very powerful also. UCLA's Russell Pudrick has shown that the role of dopamine may be motivational, where opioid system, which we have in our brain, we have natural opioids, even if we don't get them from outside, appear to be central to pleasure. If you block the dopamine system in rats, they still enjoy the rewards, but they won't do any work to get it. So there's a differentiation between motivation and reward. A couple other brain structures. Ventral, tegmental areas. That's a primitive area in the brain. This is the primitive part. Here's the higher parts that have evolved over time. So this is a primitive part. And it has to do with endorphins and opiates. Another structure in pleasure is the prefrontal cortex. Out here, the thinking part, that's what we've evolved to have. So the front part is also very much involved in thinking. And not only thinking, but in pleasure. So wiring doesn't just go in this system here. It goes out to the front of our brain, we process it, and it goes back. We'll find more detail later. It's also modulated by dopamine. So dopamine doesn't just go on here in the nucleus accumbens, which is the center of pleasure center, but out here in the prefrontal cortex too. Dopamine and belief. Researchers at the University of Bristol found that people with high levels of dopamine are more likely to find significance in coincidence and pick out meaning and pattern when there is none. They compared 20 self-professed believers in ghosts, God, spirits, and conspiracies, and compared them to 20 self-proclaimed skeptics. They showed all subjects scrambled faces and words that didn't make any, they just all scrambled in any sense. They found that the believers were much more likely to find patterns when there were none. That's what the believers do, right? They see conspiracy, they see things that may not be there. But they found the higher levels of L-DOPA that these people have naturally cause them to do that. So if we, in here, we analyze your L-DOPA levels, some of you will have higher levels than others. It means you're a little more predisposed to think certain ways. So let's give them all DOPA. Let's jack everybody's DOPA level up and see what happens. So they were given that. However, what's neat is they found that it seemed to have more effect on the skeptics. That is, increased levels of dopamine was more effective in making the skeptics less skeptical than in making the believers more believing. Interesting. Thus, dopamine seems to help the brain discern patterns in the noise. It's also linked to, we even know what chromosome it's on. And we know that there's 5 variations of dopamine that you can get. You can have little, you can be someone that's born with a lot of dopamine and all in between. It explains a lot now, I'm thinking, looking back on creativity in people, which we'll find more about. Patternicity, we talked about that. There appears to be a localization of pattern finding in the right versus the left hemisphere, and it happens for both believers and skeptics. EEG, electroencephalograph measurements, reveal that believers in ESP had more right-sided activity than non-believers in ESP. It's far too simple, however, just to say that creativity is just in the right brain and other mathematical computation or verbal is just on the left. But it has, as a concept, a lot of merit. So we're not just right or left brain. They do communicate. We already saw if communication's off, you can have these out-of-body experiences. Remember we talked about last time? So you kind of break that communication. You think there's somebody else there around someplace. It's really inside your head, but we think that's outside. Pattern finding is a continuum. At one end are people with very little ability to find meaning in order or patterns. More creative persons are further down the scale, but so are the true believers. At some point this becomes pathologic, and one crosses the boundary into insanity, schizophrenia, and paranoia, where the person can no longer tell the difference between fantasy and reality. John Nash. And we'll talk about him in a minute. There's a fine line between genius and madness. Have you heard this before?
Oh, yeah.
But this is the why. Alfred Russel Wallace, he, along with Darwin, came up with the theory of natural selection. But boy, he was way out in that he believed in that phrenology stuff. Totally, I mean, how could somebody that comes up with this great scientific theory, also spirituality and psychic phenomena, he really believed in all that stuff. But the creative part of his brain could also see this pattern in nature and come up with the same thing. So it's pretty close there. We have an error detection network in our brain, believe it or not. It's like spell check in the computer, spell check. We got the prefrontal cortex up here. That's where we try to use a lot of our higher level thinking. And the structure called the anterior cingulate cortex, which is called the ACC. Those are like error detection systems, like, oh, something's wrong there, that spelling's not right. This isn't right. The ACC seems to be the area activated when given options or multiple choices. It gives us the ability to see subtle differences in pictures or ideas. Ever seen the book, Where's Waldo, with your kids or grandkids? Where's Waldo? And you look all and try to find him. That's the part of the brain that finds Waldo. If you hurt that part of the brain, you can't find any Waldos. It's the error detection center. Stoops tasks. That's where you give people, you give them colors like red, but you type the red in green color. Or you type blue in orange color. And the brain's getting mixed messages. So you're saying red, but it's seeing another color. This is the part of the brain that says, well, the word says red, even though I got a red color. I mean, the green color. That's what those tasks are. So we know how to do that. It's part of the pattern detection system. Schizophrenics have less activity in this area, as well as less dopamine in the prefrontal cortex. So they don't have this error detection system either in the front or in the back working too hot. That's why they're kind of the way they are. And this is the area of the ACC, in case you're interested. Patternicity. People vary widely in their ability to find and recognize these patterns. If both of these things are functioning well, it allows us the ability to separate reality-based patterns and those that are not real. That is, the paranoid psychosis and conspiracy theories. This movie, anybody see this? Raise your hand. Anybody ever seen this? Great. Don't see it again after this class. I saw it for the third time last week. True story, John Nash won the 4 Academy Awards in 2001 too. Pretty neat. Russell Crowe, as you know, he was a brilliant student of mathematics and theory and game theory, and he came up, eventually won the Nobel Prize for all of his work. It just had implications, just brilliant thinking to come up with these ideas, and he eventually won the prize for that. But in the movie, you remember seeing his garage?
Yes.
Yeah. He had all these newspapers, all these periodicals. And he had letters circled, and he had arrows going all over, and all this stuff. And he's trying to make patterns out of this. Because what's his paranoid delusion? He's working for the US government. He's intercepting messages coming from the Soviet Union to the United States, to operatives here, and it's set in code. And the code is sent through periodicals and magazines and Life and newspapers. And his job is to find out the code so he can break it and help our government so the Soviets don't have this in the United States terrorist attack. And then, of course, other people are following him and trying to stop him from doing this and end him in the insane asylum. And 50 shock treatments with insulin, which was pretty crude what we used to do to people back then.
It's also a very good book.
Great book, yes.
Yeah, it is.
Cool. Now, that's I haven't read the book.
Yeah.
But anyway,
Well, it's
think about
really
that and the patternicity. So he's the example of what we're talking about. He's brilliant, but you go a little too far and you lose the sense of reality.
Always talking about the,
Belief in the brain. How is it that people come to believe something that seemingly defies reason? Answer, beliefs come first, reason for beliefs follow. That's another, that's a 10. One thing, what did you learn in the class? If you remember that, you pass. But does our brain process true, false, and ambiguous statements differently? Answer, yes. Functional MRI to the rescue. Why not see how people process by watching their brains in action? We could never do this before. We'd have to do psychological tests or guess what's going on. It's exactly what a team of neuroscientists from UCLA did in 2007. They presented subjects with a series of statements categorized into 3 areas: mathematical, factual, and ethical. It says, do we process these things differently? So not only do these categories do we process them differently, but what if we give people true statements, false, and uncertain? How do they process those? For example, mathematical, true, 2 plus 6 plus 8 is 16. Yeah, pretty good. Factual, most people have 10 fingers and toes. Yeah. Ethical, it's bad to take pleasure in another's suffering. Yeah. Okay, false, 62 can be evenly divided by 9. Yeah, don't think so. False, eagles are common pets. Don't think so. False, children should have no rights until they can vote. Oh, no. Uncertain, 1.2 to the 57th power is, I don't have a clue. I don't know if the Moors are here to tell us about that, but somebody could just... Uncertain, the Dow rose by 1.2% last Tuesday. I don't know. False or uncertain, it's better to lie to a child than to an adult. Okay. So, results. Significant difference in the reaction times. True, much shorter. Boy, if you see a true statement, bam, you process that sucker right away. Belief triggers spikes in the prefrontal cortex, the decision area, okay, for rewards. But false and disbelief trigger brain activity in the anterior insula, an area opposite to the pleasure center and associated with negative stimuli, pain perceptions, disgust, as well as bad tastes and odors. We got the pleasure center in our brain, we got this center too. So if you think there's something bad or gross body excretions, anything else, bad ideas, that part goes ding, 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 ding. And here, false beliefs and disbeliefs go to that center. That's interesting. Uncertain statements revealed neural action in the ACC, that's the where's the Waldo area. To think about it, the area of the brain that's involved in error detection and conflict resolution. Okay, this is all neat. So, what do we conclude from this? Just as we seem to accept appearances as reality until proven otherwise, we assess true statements faster with less pain. Right? If I tell you something true, it's sunny out, you just, no. Yeah, it's sunny out, feel good. Similarly, the brain uses the same system to process and evaluate mathematical, factual, and ethical statements. It doesn't matter if you're in Professor Schrift's philosophy class or Moore's math class, your brain's going to do the same thing when you ask a true-false question. So there isn't like, oh, the moral part of the brain and this part or the religious part. We process stuff the same way. And the scientific principle, which we're going to really rely on in our next session, that a claim is untrue unless proven otherwise, runs counter to our natural tendency to accept as true that which is comprehended quickly. So, what's our default thinking process? It's true. Science goes, no, let's go. Spinoza, famous Jewish, Dutch philosopher, 1600s, said, quote, belief comes quickly and naturally. Skepticism is slow and unnatural, and for most people have low tolerance for ambiguity. It's a great quote. This is before functional MRIs, psychology. Pretty astute observation. The brains of believers and non-believers. Let's take a look at those. That'd be fun to do. So they get another study, 15 self-reported Christians and 15 self-reported non-believers asked to evaluate the truth or falsity, like you guys did on your test, of both religious and non-religious statements. Jesus performed miracles. Michael Jordan is a famous basketball player. Angels really exist. Eagles really exist. And guess what? Faster responses in both groups to the true statements. Just because you put religion stuff in there, bam, we go right there. Processing occurs, in the ACC, area detection system, especially the prefrontal cortex, in areas directly linked to emotional learning, and the hippocampus where memories are made. So when we're talking about these things, they go up to the front of our brain, and then they go back to this memory area where we have a lot of emotional stuff. So even though I told you the brain processes religious questions and mathematical questions differently, there's usually a little more emotional involvement in buy-in and bias, right? With religious statements. Processed the same way, but there's more emotion. I mean, 2 + 2 = 4. There's not a lot of emotional involvement in that. Both groups experience greater conflict and uncertainty. Both groups, the believers and the non-believers, are evaluating religious statements. So if you give a religious statement, even the skeptics, I'm a real skeptic, I don't have a problem. You should.
What's your firm believer, would it transfer?
If you are, the question is, if you are
If you believe in something that's not totally proven, like a mathematical problem, does it transfer in your brain from the conflict and uncertainty to certainty?
I still don't understand the question. Can somebody help me out?
Oh, what do I want to say? Is the way it affects your brain change?
Why don't you hold that and see if I answer that in the
Okay.
next little bit. And if not, I'll come back to it. So what are the take-home points? First is that belief is belief is belief. As far as the brain is concerned, 2 + 4 is handled the same as torture is wrong, or Jesus is the Son of God. Secondly, the validity of or truth of a belief depends on how it came to be, on the chain of events, emotions, and memory that link it to the world. Thirdly, the ideas of conviction or faith, which are often resorted to in religious discussions, don't have a separate meaningful mechanism in the cognitive process. I have faith in Allah is processed in the brain the same way as I have faith that Iran has nuclear weapons. Or any other statement for that matter. And so, try to remember that point. Lastly, what can be learned can be unlearned. We can, particularly in the next class, we're going to talk about how we can change our wiring, and we actually can. And that's kind of exciting to me in a lot of ways. So there's okay. What I want to do now is start getting into alligators. Where'd you get that? So pretend we're on this road and we're trying to have good thinking, and we know the road is windy, and you know, well, as a car, something's coming along, let's just move over to the side of the road. And what I'm going to tell you is there's a whole bunch of alligators over there. I don't care what the sign says. How our brains convince us that we are always right. Michael Shermer states, once we form beliefs and make commitments to them, we maintain and reinforce them through a number of powerful cognitive heuristics that guarantee that they are correct. When superimposed on the processes of patternicity, which we talked about last time, and antigenicity, they reinforce our brain chemistry and almost guarantee us false thinking. Biases of thinking. We'll now start and list, define. You've got a handout for these. You've got two handouts of them, but one of the handouts I'll have space if you want to take any notes, because there's a few of them that I want to go through that are really important, that we just want to spend time and give you examples so you really understand them. So see if you can recognize these biases in comments and statements of others. I picked a couple up when I was just watching this morning on CNN. Better yet, can you recognize and admit them in yourself? Remember, to successfully seek the truth and think critically, we must be aware of and eliminate these impediments to clear thinking. The confirmation bias, the mother of all cognitive biases. Definition: the tendency to seek and find confirmatory evidence in support of already existing beliefs and ignore or reinterpret disconfirming evidence. Ever run into anybody that works on that mindset? Yeah, but here's this. Right? Or didn't you see this evidence? No. So this is kind of the mother of all. So you remember that one and you'll be in good shape. Examples. 1981, psychologist Mark Schneider asked subjects to assess the personality of someone who they were about to meet. I have met this person. Subjects in this group were given this profile of an introvert. And of course that says they're shy, timid, and quiet. And this group is given the profile that says this person you're going to meet is an extrovert. They're sociable, they're talkable, and they're outgoing. Now go interview them and assess their personality. What do you think you find out? So, each group asks questions that will lead to the conclusion already predetermined by the profile. Oh, you're a fun-loving guy, bro. Let's get out a lot. You're pretty sociable. You're here. You don't get out much, do you? You don't talk much, do you? You see, you just questions, and you just, what do you find? But it's the same person. Results, obvious. Video of a child taking a test for you educators out there. 1983, this is not new data. Darlene Rose. Subjects were shown a video and then asked to evaluate the academic abilities of the child based on the results of the test. So they got this kid's going to take this test. And they got two groups. One group was told that this kid's from a high socioeconomic class. He's a college professor's kid. Yeah. And the other group is told this class was from a low socioeconomic. He's from a broken family, and there's no parents around the home, and he's poor, and yeah. Okay? And then you evaluate this kid. What do we find?
Yeah, yes.
Excuse me. One group rated the child as above grade average in ability. This kid has got super ability. The other group rated the child well below grade level in ability.
Yes.
Pardon? Why? Because they were told that this kid came from a low socioeconomic. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. Do you think this happens? You better believe it does. When I taught school, I remember teaching 5th grade, and I'd get some kids in my class, and the 4th grade teacher would say, "Now this Johnny, he's a troublemaker. You better watch him. He's a slow learner. He'll get in trouble. Keep an eye on him." You know, this guy, he's real smart. He's going to be teacher and professor someday. What if I, as a teacher, am I going to expect more of him or more of him? And who am I going to watch and get in trouble faster, catch? I'm watching him. He may do the same thing, but I'm going to catch him. Right? And then it's just self-fulfilling. Well, see, told you so. He's a bad kid. So when those teachers gave me their stuff together, I just says, I don't want these. Get out of here. Every kid starts from an even slate in here. So I don't care if you got all these and these and troublemaker. In my class, you guys are starting out an even turf. And that's why I taught, and that's why I graded. And they could take tests over as many times as they wanted to, until they passed it. And anyway, they changed the dynamic, right? I always find why some kids, when I taught, some other teachers in certain classes would say, oh, that kid's really bad, he's real horrible trouble. Other teachers would say, I'm not in trouble with that kid. Wait a minute, it's the same kid. I think it has something to do with it. You see how our prejudices, so this is an education. 1989, Kunder and Sherman belief study. A group of subjects was presented with evidence that contradicted a belief that they held deeply, and with evidence that supported the same belief. So evidence for what you believe, evidence against what you believe. The results showed that the subjects recognized the value of the confirming evidence, but were skeptical of the value of the disconfirming evidence. And we'll find out that scientists do this too, even though they're not supposed to. Yeah. Because of all these biases that we're going to go through. Kuhn, another study of adolescents this time, which do have different brains, by the way. 1989 study, children and young adults were exposed to evidence inconsistent with the theory they preferred. And what did they find? They failed to notice the contradictory evidence, or else, if they did acknowledge its existence, they tended to reinterpret it to favor their own preconceived beliefs. Ever try to tell an adolescent something by reasoning it? You should wear your seatbelt, you should do this or that, and show them the reason. Don't they do this? Confirm it to their belief. Very true. Another murder trial. I have the actual recordings of a real murder trial. So they had this group and they watched this murder trial. And then I find out, how did you evaluate it? And he found that, no. Instead of evaluating the evidence first and then coming to a conclusion, most, not all, most subjects concocted the narrative in their minds of whether they're guilty or innocent, and then riff through the evidence to pick out what most closely supported their chosen verdict.
Oh, boy.
It's the kid that shot the person down in southern Florida, the guy that was doing a patrol walk.
Oh, yeah.
I guarantee 90% of people, as soon as they got the thing, that they already, he's guilty, he's not guilty. The kid, you see, and then you just pick your own. But this is scary because this is supposed to be our, but that's why some people go to prison who are innocent and vice versa, right? So in a jury, we even think differently. Okay, we have, how many more minutes, Joanne? Okay, she's getting into the cutthroat time. No, brains and politics, that's a good place to stop. Okay. So, yeah, let's take a little break and then we'll continue on with the biases.
Thank you for taking your chair. A lot of people to get back into the room. If you are interested in seeing JR's first class on Channel 12, which is 121.8 or 85, depending on your set, this week it is being shown at 12 o'clock noon and at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, there was a little problem with the second half of the DVD, but that will be fixed today, correct? So tomorrow you'll be able to see the second half of the class too. But in case that you'd like to see it again, or you have friends who weren't able to get in to this class because we had a full class, you can tell them at 12 and at 5 o'clock. And so now we're ready for the second half of the second class with Dr. J.R. Paulson.
Okay, thank you, Joanne. Oh, brains in politics.
Are there?
Interesting, or maybe that's an oxymoron. An instructive study was done on the run-up to the 2004 presidential election. Many of us are already aware of how people use their belief filters to allow in information that confirms their ideological beliefs and filters out contradictory data. Let's look inside the brains of some political opposites and see what's going on. You think you're going to see any difference? What do you think? I mean, that's kind of a pretty heavy question. Yeah, what do you think?
When we're talking about the conflicted opinions, when you're a child, you have everything that comes in absolutes. Now, we were talking about murder trials. So I remember always sitting, listening to the radio at breakfast and the news. And when you heard someone was convicted of something, you assumed they were guilty. Okay? And so I remember the first time I heard a story that questioned the guilt and this possibility that justice might not be served. So I marked that as a point where I became a liberal, okay? But a few years later, you know, you think about it and you say, what's the purpose of justice, deterrence? And so you say, but even though I believe it's possible, I should support the idea of the fact that justice is always right. So even though this is a conflict, so what am I going to say on here? I believe that it's possible it's wrong, but I support the idea that it serves its purpose. The purpose is more important than the truth. And then I remember, you know, we had the thing in Illinois, and we have famous jurists who were taking this line of thinking, despite overwhelming evidence that mistakes can be made, and they still stick to the principle. So, you know. Okay,
let me try to paraphrase the question. This first point was, when he was a little kid, as all of us did, when your parents or you saw something on TV and this was true, we just accepted that that was true. And he used the example of so-and-so was found guilty in this trial. And then later, he saw a thing where they said, well, we're not sure if they're guilty or not. Like, whoa, all of a sudden, like, wait a minute, you're not sure if they're guilty. They're either innocent or guilty. It introduced uncertainty into him. Now, he said that was his seminal event where he became a liberal, but we'll leave that there. And then later, he talked about jurisprudence. And at a certain point, what point is there a conflict between knowing what you're thinking and the principle that you have? You have a certain principle, and at what point does the end justify the means, or vice versa? And we're going to get to that in the next class, because that's really key. We're going to see how these brains work now, but in the next session, we're going to find out how do we approach politics, particularly when people are so polarized at the other ends, but have strong principles that they really believe in. How do you reconcile those, particularly when you see all the stuff that our brain's going to be doing? So we will get back to that. That's good. Okay, so they took 30 men, half self-described as strong Republicans and half strong Democrats. Their task was to assess statements by both George W. Bush and John Kerry, in which the candidates clearly contradicted themselves. Not unexpectedly, Republican subjects were as harshly critical of Kerry as Democratic subjects were of Bush. Both groups gave their own party's candidate a free ride. Are you surprised?
No.
That's what we're talking about, affirmatory belief. So, let's look in their brains while they're doing this and see what happens. Interesting, I think. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the reasoning area, was quiescent. The front part of the thinking brain the lights were out. On both of them, the Democrats and the Republicans. There's nothing much going on up there. The orbital frontal cortex, the area involved with the processing of emotions, was active, as was the ACC, which we've said is trying to look at patterns and processing. Once the subjects arrived at a conclusion that made them emotionally comfortable, their ventrum striatum, that's a part of the brain with the reward system, it isn't the pleasure center, but it's like another pleasure center, became active. In other words, instead of rationally evaluating a candidate's position, we see an emotional reaction to the conflicting data. Weston states that we rationalize away the parts that do not fit our preconceived beliefs and then receive a reward in the form of a neurochemical hit, probably dopamine. Politics can be just like a drug. Get that belief? Essentially, it appears that if partisans twirl the cognitive kaleidoscope until they get the conclusion they want, and they go, I like this, then they get a massively reinforced for it, with the elimination of negative emotional states and the activation of positive ones. So we just look at that and just turn our political kaleidoscope, oh, that looks great. And we stop there and then we feel good. Isn't that scary? Okay, we'll come back to that again. We'll talk about the Supreme Court. Hindsight bias. Second big bias. The tendency to reconstruct the past to fit with present knowledge. Monday morning quarterbacking.
Yes.
20/20 hindsight. Especially common after disaster with finger pointing. Ooh, they should have done that. If they would have protected an embassy better, this would have happened. If we would have watched Pearl Harbor, all this, yeah. If he would have gone and thrown a pass on third down, or if the coach would have called time to get that guard out of there, Iowa State would have won because he was having too many turnovers. If the ref, right? We all do this. It's also common during after wars, which is interesting. Next bias, self-justification. The tendency to rationalize decisions after the fact, to convince ourselves that what we did was the best thing we could have done. Once we make a decision about a career, a job, a choice, a spouse, a purchase, we carefully screen subsequent data and filter out all contradictory information, leaving only evidence in support of what we did. This guarantees that we will almost always be satisfied with the decision, even in the face of evidence to the contrary.
Oh my.
Anybody ever use that or seen that? Experts, I love this, are significantly less likely to admit that they are wrong compared to non-experts.
Oh, yeah.
So you professors in the room, buck up. Or, smart people believe weird things because they are better at rationalizing their beliefs that they hold for non-smart reasons. So I love that quote. I ever try to argue a position as somebody that's kind of smart? You know, somebody that's maybe so they kind of maybe listen. Not the experts. Who introduced the bill, and who said what? They'll take a bill in Congress, and they've given these Democrats and Republicans. And they say, well, what do you think of this bill? But they preface it with who introduced it. If a Republican introduced it, it's a kiss of death. If a Democrat introduced it, well, that's probably got some potential. That's probably got some good points in there. No bias there. Unfortunately, this bias is not uncommon in the criminal justice system. Who's that? Supreme Court. What's the date on that? Monday, March 26th. No, 25th. Yeah. What are they talking about? Homosexuality, gay marriage, right? Okay, so there's the Supreme Court. Let's do a little straw poll in here. From what you know, and I don't expect you to be jurist experts, how many think the Supreme Court is, as a group, are pretty conservative? Raise your hand. The court's conservative. How many think the court is liberal?
The majority is.
How many think it's middle of the road? Okay. 100 Democrats and Republicans view the Supreme Court. According to a recent Pew poll, I'm talking right recent, conservative Republicans see the court as 45% of them see it as liberal, 39 middle of the road, 16 conservative. Liberal Democrats see the court as 21% liberal, 31% middle of the road, and 48% conservative. It's the same Supreme Court. See how you see? I don't know if that fits with how, if you fit with that demographic, but we've already got our ideas of what, looking at the same thing. And I don't care how well you've looked at all the cases or it's just the gestalt that you've got, but just be aware of that. Looking at the same thing. Attribution bias. I love this one. This is one of my favorite ones. The tendency to attribute different causes for our own beliefs and actions than that of others. This can be either situational or dispositional. What do I mean by that? Situational. We identify the cause of someone's belief or behavior in the environment. Her success is a result of luck, circumstances, and having connections, or because of their family. So if somebody does well, it's because of this. Dispositional is where we identify the cause of someone's belief or behavior in the person as an enduring personality trait. His success is due to his intelligence, his creativity, his hard work. But the problem is we naturally use our self-serving bias and attribute our own success to positive character traits. I'm hardworking, intelligent, and creative, and attribute others' success. They were just lucky they got that faculty tenure position. Circumstances or environmental advantage. It's just the way there's other people on the committee, it wasn't. But I got my tenure position because I'm a better person. I'm a hard worker. You see the difference? This is a form of personal spin doctoring. Sherman and Solway, God belief study. Pretty powerful study. 10,000 random Americans, not a couple thousand. So they gave essay questions, not just simple true and false, so you can explain yourself, which is nice, of why they believe in God, and then why do other people believe in God? The study clearly demonstrated the intellectual and emotional attribution bias. So that's an attribution what are we going to attribute? Intellectual, emotional. So what are you guys going to predict? Those of you that said yes on the God thing, or other people, and I tell you, we showed the survey how many people do, a certain large portion believe in God. And so why do you think people, what are you going to say when we ask people what they believe? Let's just throw some, why are people going to believe in God? Whether you say it personally, from your self point of view, what do you think people are going to say?
About themselves.
Yeah, about themselves. What would they say?
Intellectuals.
Because I'm intelligent.
The intellectual
And other
decision.
people do it on the basis of emotion.
And other people do it on the basis of emotion. Boy, what a skeptic. You hear what she said? She said, I do it on intellectual, and other people do it on...
Actually, I was saying that's what I think people.
That's what you think. No, we don't do that. But we think other people do that. All right. Let's clarify that. We don't do that. Well, the top two reasons that people gave for why they believe in God were the good design of the universe and the experience of God in everyday life. However, when asked why others believe, these answers dropped to 6th and 3rd place. Others believe in God because that belief is comforting and because of the fear of death. We see our own beliefs as being rationally motivated, but see others as being emotionally driven. Mary Lou, have you seen this slide before? Think about that. I'm going to leave that up a little bit. I'm going to process that. All those people, they're just a bunch of, they need something to, because they're afraid of death and they, We're gonna talk about religion, remember, the next class. But without these biases, so you see this? Very common. Gun control. Aha! You may hear someone attribute their own position to reasoned intellectual choice. Statistics show that crime decreases with gun ownership decreases, or crime decreases with gun ownership, and attribute the other person's opinion to emotional need. He's for gun control because he's a bleeding heart liberal who needs to identify with the victim. Or he's against gun control because he's a heartless conservative who needs to feel embodied and empowered by having a gun. Attribution bias is ubiquitous in almost all political discourse. We different motivations for ours and other people. That's why the gun thing, everybody's fighting. We are got statistics and stuff, and I say they're just a bunch of, gun toting, and vice versa. All those liberal people. See how this works? You guys are getting smarter here. Okay, next one. Another bias. Maybe you've seen. I'll talk about this one personally. The tendency to believe in something because the costs sunk into that belief. We hang on to losing stock, losing investments, failing businesses, electronic medical record systems, old cars, and failing relationships. We concoct rational reasons to justify those beliefs or behaviors, especially those which we have a sizable investment, especially prominent in long-held beliefs, business, and in love. We often base this on the fallacy that past investments and performance should influence future decisions. If we were really rational, we would calculate the odds of succeeding from this point forward. We use the attribution bias to criticize others for not changing their behavior, but fail to change ours. So my example for me is, we helped our son buy a house in Florida and fix it up and thought it'd be a good investment. And of course it went up and it's making all this money, and then all of a sudden the housing market, what it started doing? It starts going down. So my wife is not here, but we had a little disagreement about what we should do about that. Jesus, sell some. I said, no, we're not going to, we put all this money in sessions with it. Let's just keep our price up. Well, nothing happened. So lower the price again. Lower the price again. Lower the price again. Pretty soon you got about half the price of your house. Or if idiot would have sold it up higher, but looking back now, I'm in the sunk cost bias. I'm investing in it. We got this money in it. I'm not. Okay? Ownership costs about $100,000. That bias in my thinking. Pretty stupid. Political example: war. Politicians and others use this bias repeatedly. What were the justifications for staying so long in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan? Consider the high cost in money, trillions, and human loss, lives and wounded. Most members of Congress, Bush, Clinton, other Bush, and Obama have all stated that we should, quote, stay the course and not just cut and run. George Bush embodied the sunk cost bias when he explained in a speech at Fort Bragg, July 4th, 2006, quote, I'm not going to allow 2,527 troops who have died in Iraq to be in vain by pulling out before the job is done. Is that an example of what? I'm not going to sell my house because I've got so much invested in it, it's worth this. But you see how, what, we give a couple other thousand guys die, and more people die, and more money, but what did I tell you the premise of this bias is? The more we have invested in. So you put $1 billion in it, you put $1 trillion in it and say, well, we've invested $1 trillion, we're not going to lose that now. We'll put another $500 billion in it. Or we have all these guys coming back with PSD and all this stuff. Well, we don't want them to be in vain, let's make some more guys like that. I mean, thought bias, in my opinion. Status quo bias. Tendency to opt for whatever it is that we are used to, that is the status quo. We tend to revert to the default position, even if it might be in our own best interest to change, economic investments, or how adverse are we to risk? Example, this was neat. New York City, or New York, the state, and New Jersey offered citizens two options for auto insurance in the 1990s. Option A is it's more expensive, but you can sue. And option B is it's cheaper, but you can't sue. So clearly, both states said, okay, citizens, which one do you want to choose? You guys decide, I don't care. Well, in New York, 75% stayed with the more expensive, because that was what they already had. In New Jersey, the default was cheaper, but only 20% opted for the more expensive plan. So 20% versus 75%. You stick with what you got. Even if it costs, you lose money. That's a pretty large number of people in that. I mean, you don't have to do a psychologist to make that study, it just happened. Good data for that. The endowment effect bias, the tendency to value what we own more than what we do not own. Thaler found that owners of an item value it roughly twice as much as buyers of the same item. They give these people and say, here's a $6 mug. Yeah, it's empty. So there's a $6 mug. You say, okay, it's worth $6. How much you want to sell this for? They ask all these people, how much you sell it for? And they have a show. I sell it for $5 1/4. Now, yes, this guy. How much you buy that mug for? I give you $2.75 for it. It's the same mug. This one's $6. You see the difference? If it's our mug, it's worth more. Ownership endows value by its very nature. And nature has endowed us to hold on to what's ours. Animals mark and defend their territories, right? Dogs protect their bones, which all underpins the concept of private property. So that's why politically, private property kind of, it's strong. You can be utopian thinking, but it goes back evolutionary. There's a reason for this. Animals and people will expend about twice as much effort and energy to hold on to something rather than go out and get or take the same thing. We want ours, even though we could get a replacement or another. Ever try to mark prices for items at a garage sale? Or get your spouse to get rid of some of his or her junk versus our treasures? That's why that's mine, you know? That's valuable. For garage sale, oh, this is worth this. People go, why didn't it sell? You know, how much for that piece of... Is this true? Am I making this stuff up?
No.
Okay, good. Endowment bias in beliefs. Beliefs are a type of private property. So the endowment effect applies just as much to them as it does to your little teddy bear that you had. Perhaps even more so, because of the emotional capital invested. How often do you see major changes in religious or political beliefs? I can't think too many times I think of some Republican that just suddenly becomes a Democrat, or some Roman Catholic who suddenly becomes, flips over because becomes a Buddhist, or a Buddhist. I mean, you get there's flipping or a fundamental Christian. It don't happen much. There's probably a reason. In addition, the more someone has publicly committed to their belief, the more they value it, and the less likely they are to change or give it up. Particularly in politics, they espouse something, and even in the face of data that's showing it's wrong, they publicly stated that. They've got all that emotional stuff in there. You think they're going to retract that? Question in the back.
I think we all behoove ourselves to be open-minded, regardless of the truth that we hold, because everybody can grow from being open-minded. And
Sounds noble.
that's the easiest way to say it.
That's excellent. And I'm going to do the same thing when we in part 3, because I'm gonna say, how do we put all this stuff together then? And that's gonna be a point that's gonna come up that I'm gonna make. Because we got all this, then how do we deal with this? How do we deal with people and humans if they're like this? Framing bias, the tendency to draw different conclusions based on how the data is presented. This effect is especially common in economic decisions and beliefs. Consider the following. Okay, you're in store A. You're gonna get an iPhone. It's $300. But you get on your little, your wife's iPhone and check and go, it's 150, 5 blocks away. Okay, you gotta get a computer. You look in the computer, the Dell computer is 3,000. She gets in her iPhone and says, yeah, 5 blocks away, it's 1,500, but over at store B, it's $1,350. You know what the result is, what people do? Any guesses?
People that see a half difference, like 300 versus 150,
Uh-huh.
are more apt to go with the 150. But even though it's the same amount, they may not be as enticed to
Likely
go
to do
with
that.
1350.
Very perceptive, Jan. That's exactly what the data shows. The majority, most people, it's the same amount of money you save. You save $150 either way, don't you?
Yep.
It's exactly the same amount of money. Well, wait a minute, you're gonna drive across town to save $150, but you're not gonna drive across town to save $150. I mean, like, what kind of rational thinking is that? I mean, I didn't even give you a choice here. It's $150 save, $150 save. But you're not going across town for $150 because we frame it. Oh, it's a bigger thing, but as Jen says, wow, that's half as expensive. Oh, half as expensive, and that's what people do. Okay, CDC, Center for Disease Control. You got this Asian virus that's coming up. It's coming here, and it's going to be bad. It's going to kill 600 people, and you're the leader of a team. And you got to figure out what we're going to do, what programs we're going to come up with to make this better. We know it's coming. So your team presents you with two solutions. We got program A, and 200 people are going to be saved. We got another group comes up, we got program B, and they say, well, it's not so simple as that. There's 1/3 probability that all 600 people will be saved. But there's a 2/3 chance that nobody's going to be saved.
Same thing.
So, which would you choose? Okay, let's make it a little more complicated. So time goes by, and as more people work, we got another program, Plan C. Group comes up to you and says, 400 people are going to die in our plan. And then another group comes up and says, we got Plan D. There's a 1/3 probability that no one will die. Wow, that's great. And a 2/3 probability that all 600. We got this great vaccine, but it's only 1/3 effective. So if it works, the 1/3 is going to be fine. But if the vaccine don't work, 2/3 are going to die. And that's our chance, that's our projection on that. Now, how would you choose? Well, in the first scenario, 72% of the people chose A. But given C and D, 78% changed to D scenario. Now, you mathematicians in the back, I don't want to pick on you, but if you can do some quick armchair math, what's the difference on any of those? None. Every program is exactly the same. You're going to have exactly the same number of people who live and die. Every one of those programs is exactly the same. Yes?
As I recall, a study like this anyway was done. The instructor pointed out the error and gave the test again, and they still had a bias.
Yep. And the question was, he saw a study, something like this, and the professor even pointed out the error and said, do it again, and they still screwed up. And we'll come back with that, why that happens, yeah.
Didn't anybody ask what
Nope. I mean, they should have, but I mean,
would know that.
well, that would be good. Well, no, if nothing happens, 600 people are gonna die. So that's the ground. So if you don't have any program,
That's assumed though, isn't that?
yeah, right, I agree, but I mean, just to set up as a mind exercise.
I like to argue.
Well, that's good, I like that. But again, that's what they think is gonna happen, how many people, they could be wrong. But so, you see the power of the framing effect? We prefer to think in terms of how many people may be saved rather than how many people die. That's the key word. You hear that saved, you hear die.
Yeah.
Who'll die, that bad. This program, we're gonna save these people, we're gonna save your people. We're gonna save you, something like that. Tell them, right? And that save, and you go, oh, that sounds good. That program sounds better. Even though the math is exactly the same. Okay, inattentional blindness bias. The tendency to miss something obvious in general while attending to something special and specific. The Bible summarizes it best. There are none so blind as those who will not see. How many of you are familiar with the gorilla in the room experiment? Raise your hand. Okay, pretty famous. No, what they have is this experiment where they have two couples in white shirts and in black shirts. And they each have basketballs, and they're going to pass this back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And all the observers they've done this a zillion times, this experiment. And you count the number of times the white team, or I might tell you the black team, tosses the ball. And they play this for about 4 minutes. So you're sitting there, how many times does the white team, and they move around a little bit. But they always, the white people are always tossing the white. And then, in the middle of this, they have some guy in a gorilla costume, kind of wander through. And then, at the end of the experiment, they said, how many times did they do that? And, did you notice anything unusual in this experiment? Every time it's repeated. Over half the people, no, I didn't see anything. This is a gorilla. They don't see it. And if I tell you that, that one sex is better at picking out the number of tosses, more accurate than the other, even less people see the gorilla. Because they're more intense. If you're a male, males, we're better at doing this. I mean, I just think that's neat. Can a radiologist find the gorilla in the chest CAT scan? Lola Lipschitz brought this up to me, asked if I had heard about this at the last class. I don't know. So I went to find out. And we're going to see the power of the inattentional blindness bias in a professional group who studies pictures for a living. That's what all these guys do, is look at pictures, right? Sue, can you spot the gorilla in this CT scan? Most radiologists couldn't. Now, I don't know if the lights are down enough, but I'll show you in a later picture. Up here, there is a gorilla. Here's his feet. Can you turn the lights down a little bit? Or no, we'll try. Right up here. Here's his face, here's his right arm, here's his tummy. Anyways, I'll get another one. So basically, if you didn't see it, you're not alone. They took these radiologists at Brigham and Women's Hospital, and 83% of them failed to spot this gorilla on the CAT scan. And these were credentialed radiologists, and 15 of them were expert examiners from the American Board of Radiology. They gave them these 5 CAT scans and said, is there anything wrong than usual? Now, they told them to look for nodules. There's nodules in these specific. Look for these nodules. Tell us how many nodules you find. And the gorilla, by the way, was 48 times the size of an average nodule. So it's not, we're not talking a little tiny gorilla in the corner. We're talking like the one walking in that other experiment. And they miss it. Isn't that unbelievable?
That's scary.
It's also a little scary, as Lola said, it was also scary that they only found the correct nodules 55% of the time. So they missed the gorilla, and they still, just amazing. Then they got some subjects that had no prior medical training and asked if any of them could see the gorilla, but none of them could. But they could only see 12% of the nodules. So being overtrained to look, yeah. And can you see it now? Maybe a little better right up there, the gorilla? Can you see the gorilla there, these magnified things? Gorilla, 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 gorilla. Can you see him kind of like?
Oh, now you
Be a
can see it.
radiologist to see that gorilla. But can you kind of see it? Okay. Our mind is not a video recorder. The experiment above and other examples I presented in the first class teach us to be very wary of the hubris and our powers of perception. We all are influenced by our beliefs and our expectations. Remember my example of optical illusions, wine and peach tasting? Wine, same wine, 2 different bottles, taste different, gets a higher rating in this bottle than in this bottle. Peaches, just freshly put in a can or a jar, these taste better because they came out of glass. Framing effect. We grossly misunderstand how the brain works. Our eyes are not simply video cameras, nor are our memories simple cassettes, tables able to be replayed with authenticity to the reality we experience. Extremely important point to remember in thinking about our thinking. Bias blind spot, the tendency to recognize the power of cognitive biases in other people, but to be blind to the influence on our own beliefs. And they took these people and assigned them high or low scores on social intelligence. Those students that were given the high marks rated the test fairer and more useful than those receiving lower marks. Even when asked if it was possible that they had been influenced by the scores, they responded by saying that all the participants had been far more biased than they were. So, George, you give somebody a paper and it's not very good, they go, oh, that professor, he's, can't read.
Very good teacher.
I mean, isn't that, yeah. So we all think we better. Study at Stanford. Students were asked to compare themselves to their peers on personality qualities, friendliness, selfishness. And of course, they rated themselves higher. Then you warn them, what you said. You warn them, now look, there's bias here. You know, beware, we're asking you, how do you think you and these other people compare? And then reevaluate, take the test over. 63% claimed that their initial evaluations were objective. I was right, I'm smarter, I'm better looking, I'm blah, blah, blah. And 13% even claimed, oh, I was too modest. Even after you give them the stuff. That's how powerful this bias is. I call it the Lake Wobegon effect. Where all the women are strong, all the men are good looking, and all the children are above average. That's the numeracy biases. This is for our mathematicians. The tendency to use false heuristics when dealing with frequency and occurrences of probability. It's a tendency to assign probabilities of potential outcomes based on examples that are immediate and available, especially if they're vivid, unusual, or emotionally charged. Example, your estimation of the probability of dying in a plane crash, eaten by a shark, terrorist attack, lightning strikes, etc. They're directly related to your exposure to the events themselves. So if a tornado comes through, you're a little tuned up on the frequency of tornadoes, right? Or, more commonly, to exposure in the media. Studies show that a person's chance of dying of a disease is directly proportional to the media coverage of that condition. Women in their 40s think their chance of dying from breast cancer is 1 in 10. But in fact, it's 1 in 250. See, keep seeing stuff in the media, it does change our perception of what happens and can happen. Another form of the numeracy, the tendency to judge the probability of an event in simpler or reduced terms as a form of statistical ignorance, especially when given more descriptive terms. Example, you're looking for someone to hire for your company, and you have the following resume. Linda is 31 years old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Which is more likely? 1, Linda's a bank teller. 2, Linda's a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement. Which is more likely? How many people would say A? How many people would say B? Right, 82% chose B. Mathematicians? Which is right? 1. The probability of 2 events is always less than the chance of 1 event. This is I'm sorry, it's a no-brainer. It just is. Okay, all of these experiments show that people make these snap decisions. The second one scares me. This was an example of policy experts in the government. And they asked the probability that the Soviet Union would invade Poland and the United States would break off diplomatic relations. They thought that's 4%. Another group of experts was asked to estimate just the probability the United States would break off diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. Although the latter was more likely, these experts gave it a smaller probability of happening. So here's even these policy experts, they can't even understand probability of getting invaded by another country. And I mentioned in the first class the effect it can have on a jury. The more descriptive and details the lawyer can give, the more likely we're to believe it. So the more data you come up with, our brains think, there must be more data. Not on the facts, just more stuff. Middle of the land belief. Basically, this is saying, ask people, which one of these is more likely to occur? Tailheads, tailheads, tailheads. That's not really the same. We do not understand this concept of regression to the mean. So ordinary events do not always require extraordinary causes. We'll get back to this in religion and ESP and all that stuff. But our need for patternicity and agenticity, as we talked about last time, almost demands that we create a belief to explain them even when what's not needed. So something wild happens, and we go, wow, we gotta have a cause for that. That's a miracle. No. Statistically, that's just going to happen sometime. You're going to get 15 hits in a row. You're going to make 20 three-point shots in a row. It's just going to happen, statistically. It ain't a miracle. And we don't have to come up with stuff. But our brains don't deal with that very well. If you want to learn more, this book, I mentioned before, it's great. The Drunkard's Walk. How randomness rules our lives. Okay, so how do we find the truth with all these evolutionary, neurologic, chemical, and psychological biases working against us? The goals for part 3 next week will be just that. I will posit that science is the ultimate bias detection process. We'll review the principles we learned in the first class and combine it with points learned in the second class to attempt to look again at all the things on the list of beliefs that we talked about. ESP, aliens, the God, devil, evolution, etc., in lieu of our new knowledge of critical thinking. We'll address the idea of faith in the domains of science and religion. What should be the new meta-narrative for spirituality versus our critical thinking, in lieu of our new critical thinking? What would I propose as a simplified model for seeing the world as it is, not just what we want it to be? And I do mean simplified because I'm simple. And yes, how do we converse or deal with all of those people that are kind of lower down on the rational thinking ladder? We'll try to tie this all together into what I found to be an empirical, real-world approach in our next class, Finding the Truth. So I'll conclude with this little cartoon. Should we rename our species? Homo sapiens? Nah. Homo rationalis? Nah. Homo stupidus? No, maybe. But someone showed me this. A patient came in a couple days ago. New species on the planet. Homo slack-ass erectus. New species discovered. Let's see, what does it say? Referred to as Homo slack-ass erectus. Characteristics by unusual spineless posturing and spasmodic upper arm gestures, which new research has shown to cause shorter legs and inability to ambulate other than in an awkward striding gait. The drag crotch shape also seems to affect brain function. Expect no eye contact or intelligent verbal communication. Unfortunately, most are highly fertile. So, we'll do that for next week. Thank you.
Thank you, JR. Along with the rest of you, I can't wait until next week to see you next week for the third class of JR's course at 10 o'clock sharp, so come a little early. Thank you for coming this morning.